So I've recently stumbled upon this article called "The Last of Us has Witcher fans wishing HBO produced the adaptation." Now, I've seen people saying this long before The Last of Us TV show came out, but it's true that there were some posts specifically about this on the Witcher subreddit recently. And it's true that when HBO is adapting something when there's a source material available, they are usually doing pretty good job in terms of how close to the source material the adaptation is.
Your watch is broken.
Your watch is broken. You mumble in your sleep.
You mumble in your sleep.
The problem is that The Last of Us and The Witcher are two completely different things. The biggest advantage of The Last of Us show is that one of the actual creators of the game is working on the adaptation. I also think that the reason why the show has such a good atmosphere is that the setting is just post-apocalyptic USA, and therefore it's something that the American filmmakers understand easily, because it comes from their culture. That's why the cities, sets, locations, props and stuff like that look authentic, because it's like a second nature to the people who are working on the show. Another thing is that even though it's a slightly more fresh and unique take on zombies, it still falls under the zombie genre, which is very well established in pop culture and even the biggest normies understand it. Then on the other hand you have The Witcher, which is pretty unique even for the fantasy genre. And if you follow my channel, you know what I think about filmmakers and their view of the fantasy genre. They think that everything in this genre is just epic high fantasy, where a group of heroes goes on a quest, or some chosen one has to save the whole world from a dark lord. So just the most basic idea of a fantasy world and story. Hollywood filmmakers are just normies, especially when it comes to the fantasy genre. So it's logical that they won't understand The Witcher, which is very medieval and also distinctively Polish. My point with this video is that even if you would give The Witcher adaptation to HBO instead of Netflix, it would probably be better in terms of how faithful it would be to the source material, but I doubt that they would be able to capture the right atmosphere, because that has to be done by someone who understands our culture. And you might say that that's not really important, but look at Blood Origin. That's what you get when you don't pay any attention to the atmosphere. Something that doesn't look like The Witcher at all, and it's instead like every other epic high fantasy show. The reason why the atmosphere in the Witcher games is so good and unique is that it was done by Polish developers.
The story begins with The Witcher 1.
Yeah.
So I was reading the books and I'm a huge Sapkowski's fan, but then the game appeared on the market, and I was really waiting for it. And I start playing with hope that finally it will be like a really good Polish game,
Right.
and that I will feel the same atmosphere like I had in the books. And it was like that.
What was it you liked? What was it, the sort of the same rich Slavic lore that was in the books, or was it the questing, or the... Everyone says atmosphere.
Atmosphere, exactly. I don't know how to explain that, because what is atmosphere? Like music, colors of the game, maybe some plot, but to be honest, if you want to point it out, you don't know exactly what is it.
Right.
But it is. Like The Witcher 1 was in my opinion, the most Sapkowski game like we did in STP.
I've already briefly mentioned this in my video about Blood Origin, but the Witcher books were essentially built on fairy tales and folklore. That's why the way villagers behave in this world is very reminiscent of our own culture in Central Europe, because the spirit of countryside and village life or folk life is still in a recent memory. The folklore, customs and traditions, superstitions, religiousness and spirituality, connection to the land, nature, agriculture, and so on. These things are still alive here, because we are still commemorating them, and it creates a certain mentality, which you can see in the books. And this mentality was also captured brilliantly in the games. If you want specific examples, the folklore is represented, for example, by the monsters like Noon Wraiths and Night Wraiths. Those are really well known in our folklore. Big part of folklore is also music, which complemented the game brilliantly in The Witcher 1, where you can hear instruments which are common in Slavic folk music, like cymbalum for example. And in The Witcher 3, you have of course the soundtrack by the amazing band Percival, which makes Slavic folk music. Customs and traditions are represented by the maypoles in The Witcher 1. That's a tradition we still do to this day, and it's very well known in my country, because you can see maypoles even in the smallest villages every year in May. Religiousness and spirituality is represented by those eternal fire shrines in the outskirts of Vizima that you have to take candles to. I know that they were there mainly because of the quest and story purposes, but little chapels or crosses in the fields and meadows are a very common thing in Central Europe. You can see connection to the land, nature and agriculture, firstly in the way that developers from CDPR depicted the countryside, which looks like an ordinary but beautiful landscape of Central Europe. But not just that. They even included specific trees and plants you can often see here. There are birches, willows, poplars, and probably my favorite flowers, field poppies in wheat fields. And then with all the livestock around, like cows, geese and chickens, you can really feel this connection people have to the land and agriculture. There are of course many other examples of folklore and mentality of common people from the countryside throughout the games, but I had to pick some specific ones. And a big part of The Witcher is also horror, which is a consequence of The Witcher being built on fairy tales and folklore in my opinion, because old fairy tales were really morbid and folklore is full of creepy things. Huge part of horror atmosphere is created by the soundtrack in The Witcher games. In The Witcher 1 you have locations with a really creepy atmosphere like Vizima outskirts at night, crypts, Vizima's cemetery, swamp cemetery, and so on. In The Witcher 2 you have the quest in the Flotsam Asylum, and in The Witcher 3 there's so many creepy moments, but I really like the quest called A Tower Full of Mice on Fake Isle. That was really memorable. Then there's of course also the medieval side of The Witcher, which was depicted so well in the games with the cities, castles, armors and weapons. There's a reason why medieval reenactors love The Witcher so much, that they are making expensive costumes, which are functional and mostly made from authentic materials and not PVA foam and other modern materials which cosplayers tend to use. And it's not just costumes of specific characters. There are groups which do costumes and armors of whole factions from The Witcher, like Nazir Brigade, Maena Commando, Butchers of Redania, or Temerians. I will put links for social media of these people and projects in the description box, so if you like The Witcher, please go follow them. I hope that somebody will also do the Order of the Flaming Rose or Salamandra and other factions like that in the future. But anyways, do you think that anyone would want to do costumes out of this? Or this? Yeah, I don't think so. And then with the cities and castles, I always loved how ordinary and realistic they looked in the Witcher games compared to your typical high fantasy or even low fantasy like Game of Thrones, which has a bit of that medieval aesthetic as well, but it still has pretty high fantasy looking castles. I think that CD Projekt did such a good job with this because there are castles almost on every corner in Central Europe, and even some of our towns still have some remnants of medieval streets, houses or fortifications. So people who live here usually have a pretty good understanding of this, even if they are not into medieval stuff. And it's the same with the armors and weapons. Everyone has usually been to some reenactment event like Battle of Grunwald, Battle of Libushin, or even some smaller event which sword fighters usually organize at castles during summer season. What I'm trying to say is that we have a pretty strong connection to medieval history here. And no offense to Americans, but there aren't as many things like this in your culture. Not to the point where even the biggest normies would have some idea of how actual castles, medieval armors and weapons look like. And I'm not saying that normies in Central Europe know what these things should actually look like, but there's at least some connection already, which helps in my opinion. And I think that projects like Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example, are proof of that. Now, do you think that any American filmmaker knows about little cultural details like this when it comes to the folklore and history, and would be able to capture the same atmosphere from the books like the Witcher games did? I highly doubt it. And it doesn't matter if it's Netflix or HBO. People who don't live here just don't know much about our culture and don't understand its spirit. And I don't blame them, by the way. It's just the reality of the situation. But to be fair, we are pretty bad at presenting our culture to the rest of the world, and there aren't many projects from our culture that would be focused on foreigners. That's why I started this channel, because I wanted to do something about that. But anyways, it's not just filmmakers, by the way. I see this even among the Witcher fans from different countries. I often stumble upon fan arts where the ordinary medieval aesthetic and atmosphere of our countryside is missing completely, and it just looks like some high fantasy. And I don't want to insult anyone, but look at this. It looks like something from World of Warcraft. This artist is actually really good at doing high fantasy artworks, but that's not a very good fit for the world of The Witcher. If you want to do it right, the best setting for The Witcher is the ordinary medieval look of Central Europe. That's why The Witcher should just be done by someone who understands it really well and is from Poland or at least from Central Europe. And before you say that we've already seen how that would go with the Hexer, this show is over 20 years old. It had a low budget and it still did a better job than Netflix in some ways. People also still don't realize that Polish cinematography came a long way since then. Look at Legendy Polskie, for example, and specifically the episode Jaga. This is a 6-year-old project, it has exactly the atmosphere that The Witcher should have, and it also has a pretty cool action scene with great visual effects. Now imagine that instead of this modern-looking SWAT team, there would be witch hunters going after some sorcerers, and she would demolish them like this. Can you imagine how cool that would be? And I know that this was directed by Tomáš Baginský, who also made a lot of cinematic trailers for the Witcher games, and he's now executive producer for the Netflix show. I honestly don't know what he's doing there, because it's obvious from his previous work that he understands The Witcher pretty well. But I think that he wanted to get into the Hollywood circles so desperately that he just became only a yes man to his rich. Anyways, it might seem that I think a Hollywood adaptation of The Witcher just can't be done. That's not completely true. I think that it could be done, and there's a pretty simple way to do it. I was recently watching this Corridor Crew video about a Halo fan film they've made.
So, the Halo TV show on Paramount Plus might have left a bad taste in your mouth.
AI off.
I'm introducing myself to the rest of the team.
Go. Disappear.
They did a lot of things right with that show, the VFX is pretty sweet, but they kind of just missed the mark on what a Halo story should be.
Wow. Okay.
The thing is, that's already been done. There's been awesome Halo live-action content that's been created already. We had Forward Unto Dawn, you had Neil Blomkamp's Landfall trailers, and one of my favorites is the We Are ODST trailer. It encapsulates everything that a Halo live-action piece can be. It really brings you down to a human level. You know, the attention isn't on these crazy Spartan super soldiers. It's just on the average, everyday men and women that are supposed to be serving in the UNSC. It feels a lot more gritty and real. It's more of like Band of Brothers rather than Power Rangers, which was kind of the feeling a lot of people got from the Paramount show. For our film, I want to tell a more grounded story that's focused more on the human side of things, rather than try to be an all-encompassing space opera.
When I'm watching something like this, I'm wondering, why don't Hollywood companies ever hire actual fans of the source material as advisors? I never understood why studios buy famous and beloved IPs because they want to make loads of money, but then they give it to some random nobodies who were never fans of the IP in the first place. They hate the fact that they have to create something for a bunch of nerds, and therefore despise the thing they are supposed to work on, and they want to do their own thing. If Hollywood studios are spending so much money, shouldn't they cover all their bases, do their research and make sure that they know everything they can about the IP and the people who will adapt it before they start producing the adaptation? I get that people who buy these IPs are usually bigwigs, businessmen and not creatives, so they don't understand these IPs at all and they don't care about them, but I would still expect them to protect their investments. Why are you even buying the IP if you then leave the rest of the production up to a chance that the creatives will do a good job? That's like actual gambling. And if you want to do that, that's okay. It's your money. But I thought that the reason why there's so many adaptations, sequels, prequels, spin-offs, reboots, remakes and so on is because movie studios are afraid of taking a risk with something new and original that's unknown. So if they are afraid that people won't watch something original, why aren't they afraid that fans won't watch something that's shitting all over their favorite IPs? It seems so strange to me. But I guess that these suits think that the quality of the product doesn't matter if you just slap a popular brand on it. All these nerds will eat it up anyway. I wonder how that is going for them. But back to my original point. Imagine that when a movie studio buys rights for some IP, they would first contact actual fans of the source material and have them explain what's so appealing about it and what they would want to see in the adaptation. Do you know who would be most qualified for something like this? People who are already making good quality fan films from that world. Because it's clear that they are obsessed with the IP so much that they dedicate their free time and money to it. And if the fan community loves it, you have a proof that they understand well what made the original great. As someone who is usually pretty up to date on what's happening in the Witcher community, I know about 2 high quality fan projects like that. Alzur's Legacy, which was made by Polish fans, and then The Witcher Stories, which is a series which is still being made by Czech fans. Now, I will probably always be pretty biased here, because I'm a member of the team behind The Witcher Stories, but despite that, I honestly prefer The Witcher Stories because Alzur's Legacy is focused on main characters, and I'm kind of tired of seeing that. It's a bit like with The Witcher cosplayers. I've seen so many cosplays of Geralt, Yennefer, Ciri and Triss that it does nothing with me when I see another one, and I appreciate it way more when someone does a game-friendly costume of some original character like a Scoia'tael member or some soldier. And even with the books, I love the parts about unimportant characters like Applegut, Black Rayla, Kenasselborn and so on. That's why I love The Witcher Stories, because it's focused on original characters which are unknown and unimportant in the world of The Witcher. But don't get me wrong, Alzur's Legacy is still an amazing fan film. Now let's see if The Witcher Stories have the right formula for distilling the Witcher atmosphere. Let's take all the elements that I've mentioned before with the games and see if they are present here. The folklore is represented by the whole episode with the Night Wraith. That's a story almost like some ballad from a collection of Slavic fairy tales we have in my country. And in terms of soundtrack, that's made by a guy who is a member of a Slovakian folk band called Strigoň. They started on covers of songs by Percival and then started doing their own Slavic folk music. So it's a great fit for The Witcher Stories because it has that Slavic vibe. We unfortunately don't have any representation of customs and traditions yet. I had an idea for a short story about the custom of burning the effigy of Falka, which is mentioned in the books and is very similar to our customs like burning and drowning of Morana and burning of the witches. So that might be something that you could perhaps see in the future. Religiousness and spirituality is again represented by the episode with the villagers, where you can see the young lad carving out some sort of idol with a face on each of those 4 sides, which is a very common phenomenon in Slavic folklore. There's for example the Zbruch idol, which probably inspired those idols you can see in the fields around murky waters in The Witcher 1. In terms of connection to the land, nature and agriculture, just the setting of Central Europe does so much. One of our biggest advantages is that there's beautiful countryside almost everywhere in our country, and there's so many breathtaking places we can use. What I also love is that there are often shots where you can see specific trees and flora which is typical for Central Europe. For example, in the episode with the villagers there's birches everywhere, and then in the episode with the elven blacksmith you have this beautiful shot of rosehip, which is typical for the autumn season, and people from the countryside make tea out of it. You can even see it in some of our fairy tales where the poor hero eats it because he's hungry and doesn't have money for a proper meal. When it comes to livestock, at the moment we unfortunately only have sounds of horses and chickens, which are presumably out of frame, but there should be sheep herding in the future and probably even more farm animals. I would also love something like a shot of a witcher riding on his horse through the countryside, and there would be people working on the field, fruit picking in some orchard or fishing in some river. Small details like this really help build the atmosphere and make the world feel alive. The horror elements are represented by the episode with the Night Wraith. There's one scene in particular which is straight up horror. When it comes to the medieval look, that's again one of our biggest advantages because, as I already mentioned, there's castles on every corner here, so we don't have to build any sets and you can see locations like this in many episodes. There will even be a proper castle in a future episode. Another huge advantage is the Czech Witcher community, because there are whole groups of people I've already mentioned where a lot of them do reenactment, but they also love LARPing, fantasy and The Witcher in particular, and because they know how to do costumes for living history standards, it carries over to their Witcher costumes, which you can see on small details like the texture of proper materials, handmade seams, or even how worn down their costumes are, because they've been using them for years. So yeah, this is how you do The Witcher right. Now imagine if there would be some big Hollywood production like HBO, which would want to try another attempt at doing some show or movie from the world of The Witcher. Imagine that they would first contact the Czech Witcher fan community and the team behind the Witcher stories and ask us what's so appealing about The Witcher for us and what we would want to see in the adaptation. They wouldn't have to do any research because we already understand The Witcher really well and they would have all this knowledge on a silver platter. I'm not sure if this would work anyway, because I think that there would have to be real humility on both sides, and I suspect that it would be below most of these filmmakers to listen to some nerds who don't understand the real filmmaking. But that's just it. The same way I wouldn't dare to lecture some filmmakers about their craft, I would also expect them to listen and respect the opinion of someone who understands the source material really well. And this is something that Peter Jackson did so well with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. From what I've heard, they always went back to the books when they were not sure with some decision. When someone like Christopher Lee or Ian McKellen said, well, this is how it was in the books, Peter Jackson would listen to them. And guess why The Last of Us show is such a good adaptation? Because the creators have a very similar mindset.
My philosophy on this show has always been, when should we deviate and when should we come back? If it's kind of the same or worse, we stay where the game is. If it's better, we deviate.
So yeah, there you have it. It's very important that there's someone involved in the production who understands the source material and the culture which it comes from. But then it's even more important that the person who is calling the shots in the production trusts this advisor, listens to him and respects the source material. And unfortunately, that's almost never the case. That's why I think that it doesn't matter who's making the adaptation, if it's Netflix or HBO. Good adaptations are just way too hard to pull off in the Hollywood system. And that's all I have about this topic. I hope that this video wasn't too rambly. I'm usually trying to cut out the fluff and get to the point as quickly as possible, but people in the comments then say that they want to hear me talk more, so I've tried it for once. We'll see how it goes. Let me know in the comments if this was too long and boring if you got to this point. Anyway, see you in another video.